Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another interview. I can finally say welcome back because this is my second interview. I get to interview somebody who I'm really excited to interview, as when I was doing my research, I realized this person has a lot to say and a lot of amazing ideas. So, without further ado, here is Donny Winter.
Hello, Elijah. Thank you for having me. I adore my Kaiju ramen family, so I am excited to sit down and have this conversation with you.
I so when I was like, okay, yeah, I'd love to. And then when I was conducting my research for these questions I've got, I was like, I could have not been given another perfect person to interview. I was watching some of your growing up with Godzilla's and some of your earlier stuff, and I was like, there's so much here that I'd love to learn, like what the process is. There's just so much. So thank you so much for coming on here and giving me this opportunity to interview you.
Well, of course, and thank you for the outlet. I think it's important for fans to collaborate and to engage with one another on a creative front. So, like any opportunity I get to have conversations about what I do, I always try to take those opportunities. It's important.
I love it. So to start off, for anybody who doesn't know who you are, could you please introduce yourself so everybody will know where they can find you, who you are, and what you do?
Well, my name is Donny Winter. I've been in the Godzilla fandom online for a very long time, since like the early 2000s. I remember the old message board days where those old message board days where we all just gathered together and we were just kind of in this chaotic isolation of just message boards, right? But I began in the fandom writing Godzilla fan fiction, and then that transitioned later on as I found other outlets to doing YouTube. And fast forward to now, I have my own Godzilla podcast called Growing Up with Godzilla that has somehow turned into something pretty cool. And it's been very much a full circle moment because I've always wanted to create and do long form projects. So Growing Up with Godzilla kind of became the ideal project for me to do. So don't worry, everyone. I still write Godzilla fan fiction from time to time. So
I love it. So it's a basic question, but it's so important. For the record, what's your favorite kaiju film?
kaiju in general, so it doesn't have to be a Godzilla
Yep.
film. My favorite kaiju film is probably Rebirth of Mothra 1996. Rebirth of Mothra 1996, I feel like, is one of the most underrated kaiju films out there. It is, of course, geared toward children. If you go into watching it thinking that in your mind, I think it's a little bit easier to absorb it and process it. But the films, like the whole Mothra trilogy, very whimsical, great music, interesting characters. Even sometimes the children can be interesting characters, surprisingly. And we get great kaiju fights in those films. Like the whole first film, like 75% of that film is just one giant kaiju battle. It's great.
Interesting. I've never heard that answer before. I love it.
Well, many people watching this, especially if they know me, will know that I can deliver a dissertation on the Mothra trilogy, and I'm totally fine with it. If anybody ever needs a dissertation on those films, I am here and ready for you.
So, Donnie, what is your relationship to the kaiju genre, and like, how did it send you down the path of content creation? You brought up how you wrote Godzilla fanfics, and that led into writing, which
Right.
eventually snowballed into the YouTube channel. So, how did all of that like come to be?
Well, I think for me, kaiju films became an escape, especially during a difficult time in life. Like when I was a kid, I was bullied quite a bit, and eventually, like in high school and college, I came out as gay, and I just really felt misunderstood a lot of the time. And Godzilla films became like that comfort for me, where I could escape somewhere, right? I could, witness these characters overcoming obstacles, and that kind of translated to me as like, well, Donnie, like, you can do this too. Like, if you can, you know, you have to go to school the next day to deal with these horrible people who are treating you horribly, right? If Godzilla can overcome this obstacle, then you can definitely overcome what you're about to deal with as well. And it kind of like instilled in me just this sense of resolve, I guess, if that makes sense. But later, when I branched into writing Godzilla fan fiction, that again, that added to the outlet. I was able to retreat to my own world where I could like create characters, create stories, add to stories that already exist. And there are so many memories of just spending hours and hours into like the wee hours of the morning writing fanfics and losing myself in them. But at a certain point, I think the kaiju films gave me a little bit more of a purpose because storytelling is important to me. And I like with growing up with Godzilla, for example, like my goal with it is to try to help people like share their stories, their connections with the character, because most of us, whether we are aware of it or not, have a very interesting relationship with Godzilla. We have different entry points into the franchise, right? So I think it's important for us to share those experiences because our histories in relation to the franchise seem significant to me, at least.
Wow. I wasn't expecting that answer. That's a really good answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, you mentioned that you found your calling growing up and in high school. Before that, did you want to create content, or was that something you learned about yourself in high school?
I'm glad that you mentioned that actually. So before the whole fan fiction era of the life, there was a point in time where, like, I got into Godzilla when I was a kid. Like, my first Godzilla film was the original Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla. Both of my parents were huge Godzilla nerds, so, like, my little brother and I very quickly gravitated to the giant dinosaur esque creature, right? But at a certain point, like, I went through this phase where I loved drawing a lot. I don't draw anymore, mostly because I don't have the patience. But I started creating like my little own comic books. So like I would take like 10 pieces of lined paper, staple them all together, draw like so many different things, create stories. I found ways to make crossovers between Godzilla and Pokemon. Like, it was obnoxious. I'm fairly sure I have a Rebirth of Mothra series in comic book form that goes up to like 15 because it shouldn't have ended at 3 in my child opinion. But I think that's where the desire to create content came from because I loved creating those stories. They're absolutely dreadful. But when I was like 10 or 9 or 10 years old, I thought, like, I was like, Toho, where are you? Like, brilliant ideas coming here. Like, employ me as a 9-year old. That would be great. Um, I do have a future episode of Growing Up with Godzilla where I'm going to be showing them off a little bit more just for fun. Just for fun. But yeah, I would say that's where it really, really began.
Okay. In your first ever YouTube video, you mentioned that this was your second YouTube account. So, what was your
Yes.
first one?
Oh, my my first YouTube account was called X Mystic Moth X. It's terrible because like all the early like mid 2000 usernames we would have were just ridiculous. Like, I had an email account called Megamoth47 because obsessed with Mothra. I'm gonna find some way to include Mothra anywhere in it. It was my old YouTube channel. It is long since been gone, but it was basically just this small channel where I just would throw up a smattering of like music videos that I would make with like kaiju clips. Now you know why it's gone, because, copyright and stuff like that. Um,
Good old Tony.
but right. But I would also like I would upload these like annoying rants. Like the old YouTube channel was very unpolished, chaotic, and probably annoying, which is fine. That's what we come to expect with our I call it our juvenilia, like our old content that we know exists, but we don't always go back to because it's cringy, right? Not that I don't have some cringy stuff on my current channel, but that's besides the point. But no, like the X Mystic Moth X has been laid to rest. It has its memory out there, and we've moved on to bigger and better things.
Speaking of bigger and better things, you also mentioned in that first video that your old YouTube channel had 180 subscribers and it was going to take you a long time to even hit that point. Now, as of last night, I checked, you have 3.81 thousand subscribers.
Yes. Oh, it's taken 10 years to get to that point.
But
Well,
if you do
oh,
the
go ahead.
math, you've hit like, you get like 20 subscribers per video. Like, that's pretty good.
I mean, it depends on the video. I feel like I've kind of carved out my own little following that I really appreciate, and I think the reason why, because like some YouTube channels grow like very, very, very quickly. And those are usually the people that like stick to like one specific type of content, right? I like, and they discourage, like YouTube discourages you from having multiple types of content. That's just not me as a person. I like to have like a diversity of things. Like, yes, I have growing up with Godzilla, but I also have videos where I talk about current events. I have reaction videos. I have deep dive analysis videos, and the truth is I get stagnant if I feel like I'm focusing on one type of content. So I feel like my channel probably would be bigger if I just focused on one thing. But I'm stubborn and I refuse to. But thank you. Like I it's been a long road and I'm grateful to have the following that I have.
Yeah, I really wanted to, because when I was going through all your videos, I noticed that there was more than Godzilla. And I also wanted to highlight the fact that there's even like, especially in your earlier stuff, but even up till today, you also have some very deep and like personal videos.
Yes. Yeah. Well, on my journey as a creator, like I quickly realized that vulnerability is significant, especially because we live in this world where people are so discouraged from being vulnerable, right? And being that storytelling is also significant to me, I know that one major area that I began with was my show. Well, it's not a show, it's like a playlist series. I decided to do like a playlist called Bullying My Story of Survival, where I just like broke down like the decades of bullying that I had experienced to kind of just like draw awareness to it and to, make sense of where I was then versus where I am now. And it was very difficult to do. But I felt better after having done it. And of course, it led later on into me having more conversations about mental health. So like conversations about bullying and mental health and identity all kind of like bleed together on my channel. Like even in Growing Up with Godzilla, if you watch various episodes of the show, like you'll note that there are certain points where like guests and I end up having conversations about how Godzilla impacted our mental health, or how we may have come to terms with our identity because we watched some sort of perseverance happening in a Godzilla film, right? So in my brain, what's left of it, in my brain, um, it all kind of connects.
There's a lot to unpack with that one.
There's always a lot to unpack. I love it. I wouldn't
Uh
have it any other way.
I mean, to be honest, sometimes the best stuff is the stuff that takes a long time to grasp and understand.
Right. Well, that's why I'm always asking people, why haven't you unpacked why you're a Godzilla fan from the get-go, right? Like, yeah, we love watching giant monsters fight one another and destroy things, but more often than not, there's something a little more to it. So let's get to the root of that.
So you're the kaiju. So you're like the therapist for all kaiju fans.
I don't know if I would go that far. I P.S. everyone, I am not a qualified therapist. So, but I do think it's fun talking about those types of things.
So tell me, how do kaiju movies make you feel?
Make me feel?
Go for it.
Oh, they well, a lot of things. Early on, like I was mentioning before, like they kind of helped me develop a sense of belonging when I didn't feel it in the real world, right? Um, I think one of my earliest like memories is like I always wanted to be Godzilla's friend, if that makes sense. Like when I was a kid, like I would really gravitate toward, like Godzilla versus Megalon, for example. Like I wanted to be Jet Jaguar because I wanted to be Godzilla's friend. Or Ghidorah the Threaded Monster. I wanted to be Rodan or Mothra. I wanted to be friends, like just collaboratively, defeating the bully, the infringer, the person doing horrible things. That was where that sense of belonging came. And now I think that as a person who loves analyzing things a lot, like Godzilla films and kaiju films in general just allow for interesting angles of analysis to take place, socio-political commentaries on things. Like there's so much that the films make me feel, but like, I think I could spend the rest of my life unpacking that.
Yeah. So I gotta know, what is your opinion of Godzilla's Revenge?
Godzilla's Revenge. Okay. Um, I used to love it when I was a kid.
Hmm.
And then when I was a teenager on those message boards, I went through this phase where I was just like, Godzilla's Revenge is beneath me. I like it is unelegant and annoying and without depth, right? But now that I've gotten older and I've kind of like set aside that pedantic, like, oh, I'm better than Godzilla's Revenge, I understand like a lot of different deeper meanings associated with it. Like you could do an analysis of like the trajectory of fatherhood throughout Godzilla, like the Godzilla franchise, through examining that one film, right? You could create a commentary on bullying, right? So, like, once I realized that the whole story is about, a kid, using his imagination to connect with a kaiju who is also being bullied, I was like, is this my life? Why am I hating on it? Maybe that's why I am hating on it because it's too lifelike for me. Um, but yeah, like, so I loved it, went through a phase where I detested it, and now that I am older, I'm like, it's great. I love it. I love it again.
That's one of those movies that, when I started getting into the fandom, which this is like 2009, 2008, 2010. I remember Cinemassacre's Monster Madness when he covered Godzilla. He trashed that movie. It was trashed.
I remember that video.
And
He
like
eviscerated it.
and that was like the attitude from the fandom for like the next 7-ish years, until people, like, I want to say 2016, 2017, somewhere in there, it felt like people at least listen to the audio commentary on that classic media DVD, because that commentary defends that movie really, really well.
Oh yeah.
Um, and then people started loving it again. Uh, and I know, at least when I listened to that audio commentary, I was like, "Wait a minute, let me go back and watch this movie and look at it through this different perspective." And now I appreciate it a lot more as cinema. It's Honda did a really good job with that one.
Absolutely. Well, and this happened in like the late 60s, early 70s, but like at that point, I think Godzilla was, I don't want to say oversaturated necessarily, but you could tell that they were wanting to experiment more with the franchise, right? And I feel like through the storytelling, that film is definitely an experimentation, much like the following film, Godzilla versus Hedorah. Like that, also, I would argue is an experimentation because it's a drastically different film than we would find in like the rest of the 70s or even in the 60s prior. So no, like I applaud when the Godzilla franchise chooses to experiment, kind of like recently, like with Shin Godzilla, the anime trilogy. I know people detest the anime trilogy, um, and I'm not like a huge fan of them either. However, I do appreciate that they were willing to experiment because I think that a franchise that doesn't do that is a franchise that goes stagnant, which we obviously don't want. We want more Godzilla content, right?
We don't want the Fast and the Furious franchise.
Exactly. We don't want the same thing over and over and over again. No offense to anybody who loves that franchise, but
There's room for every franchise, but no, I wholeheartedly agree with you. Um, Talking about kaiju and whatnot, your first kaiju focus video was 11 years ago, and it was titled IDW's Godzilla Kingdom of Monsters Number One. Did you expect that you would go from just that to where you are now?
no, I did not. I remember that video actually, and you really did a deep dive and did
I
your research,
did.
didn't you? Well, at that point in time, like I think on YouTube, I was just trying to find ways to branch further into the um Godzilla fandom, like through that outlet. And back then, like YouTube was a bit newer, right? So I really didn't have a direction when it came to like Godzilla. But like looking at then versus now, like I developed more of a love of long form creative projects. A podcast is obviously very much a long form creative project, right? Which I would argue, and you would know this as well as I, it requires a certain level of commitment, right? At that time in my life, I just was like throwing up videos here and there. I didn't really have like any creative focus where I wanted to kind of like flesh something out, you know. So I did not expect it to be the way it is now. However, I am happy that I have found a focus, which is a bit relieving.
It's a little less chaotic.
Yes, absolutely.
So I noticed this term. It was a message board, but I also saw it on your website under publications. What is or was Kaiju Galaxy?
Oh, okay. So Kaiju Galaxy still exists. In 2004, being on a bunch of different message boards, like I just noted that people were mean. People like if we think people are mean on social media now, if you were on the message boards in the early to mid 2000s, people were terrible sometimes. So I was like, you know what? It can't be that difficult to make a message board. It can't. So I decided in 2004, I was like, you know what? I'm going to make my own message board. I'm going to carve out my own space. I called it Kaiju Galaxy. And for like the first year, it didn't like really amount to anything. But then like in 2005, it blew up. And it like, I ended up getting like 300 to 400 members on Kaiju Galaxy from that span to like 2008 or so. And like, it was like a huge hub, which I did not expect. We prioritized like fan creativity. So like fan fiction, fan art, fan poetry, which we'll probably talk about that later. But and we would do like fan like creating like fan made kaiju and like do's and don'ts. We would even do like a tournament called the Fan Fiction Kaiju Tournament. Not the most original title, but it ended up gaining quite a bit of steam. Uh and then it spiraled into creating like a website where we would like publish fanfics and stuff like that. So Kaiju Galaxy turned like it's a very significant part of my life as a kaiju fan, especially in the 2000s. It was represented at G Fest for a number of years. We had a panel like one year, I think it was 2007, because we hosted like this large collaborative fanfic called When Aliens Attack. Um, what a throwback. Thank you for asking about that, because I do feel like as kaiju fans we don't really acknowledge the old world internet and how significant it was for a lot of people.
Yeah. So what? So I saw Kaiju Galaxy listed under publications. Is that like you published to Kaiju Galaxy, one of your works?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes, one or two of my poems are published on there, mostly because they're kaiju themed poems,
Gotcha.
right? And I was like, well, I have this outlet. If like, I might as well just publish a couple of them myself, because that's a very niche, like poetry area, right? Like any large publisher is not going to publish a kaiju focused poem because kaiju poetry is not like a significant market.
Right.
So
So you're to thank for like maybe a whole generation of kaiju fan fiction writers.
I mean, I had my own little spot in that.
That's
There is a
amazing.
yeah, like I'm glad that I could help people find an outlet, but I just I think part of the vision for me was just enjoying fan fiction writing as a long form outlet, kind of like what we were saying with podcasting. So I loved it. I don't write as much Godzilla fan fiction as I used to, and I miss it significantly. And every summer, because I'm a teacher, every summer when I get that off, I'm like, I'm going to write a Godzilla fanfic this summer. We'll see if that happens this summer.
The world of filmmaking and YouTube, it's very easy to get lost in your work, and I struggle with making time. How
Mm.
have you dealt with time management and making time?
That's a good question. And I think it's a question that every creator needs to ask themselves periodically. I used to really struggle with time management because either I would overwork or I would just set it on the back burner, right? Like the biggest obstacle that I've dealt with over the past decade, like especially with teaching is that like like certain career areas do require a lot of creative energy, right? And teaching is one of those areas. So I would find myself getting so depleted creatively where like in my mind I would want to write a fanfic or do a YouTube video or anything like that. But because I didn't associate it with being as productive as work, I would always kind of set it on the back burner. I had to completely reorient how I viewed my creative outlets because I feel like in Western society, we kind of are conditioned to devalue our creative outlets because they may not be commercially successful or they may not be making us money. We are conditioned to prioritize first whatever can sustain us financially, right? Which I feel like leaves a lot of people very, what's the word I'm thinking? Very
Empty?
empty. Yeah, like there's like this sense of profound existential emptiness that people experience because they don't have those outlets. So I had to like drastically I had to like think about it. I had to I successfully managed to work myself through it through journaling a lot because I would just like I would ask myself questions like why am I not prioritizing my creative life? Like and what is that doing to me?
Right.
And I guess that my biggest piece of advice for anybody in that type of predicament would be like acknowledge how important your creative outlet is to you and associate it with being as important as working or breathing or feeding yourself, right? Like those are all integral to our existence. And I do think that being as emotionally aware humans, outlets are just as significant as well.
Beyond just being creatively drained, what obstacles in your life have challenged you as a creator and what has inspired you?
I think some obstacles that have challenged me periodically would be, myself getting in my own way. Um, there was a point in my life where, for example, my mental health got in the way of being a creator, and I didn't use my outlets to kind of like help me gain some sort of catharsis. Like, I would just, my mental health would get in the way of me doing anything. And eventually, like, after having therapy and, getting the help that I needed, like, I was able to kind of create like a balance and actually prioritize my creative life. And it was a long it took a long time to get to that point. Well, the challenges that inspired me through, of course, having conversation and just being upfront about mental health, right? Because I think when we get to this point where we kind of just internalize everything, like, we're not really, at least for me, like, I wasn't budging, right? So once I started talking about it more, like connecting it with um my YouTube videos, connecting it in my commentaries about like Godzilla and stuff like that, I was able to work myself out of that stagnancy and into productivity, right? It was painful to do that. It was not comfortable at all to do that, but I got there. And I think that if people struggle with similar things, like, I hope that maybe that experience and that transparency might give people a template to look at, if that makes sense.
So in creating content, there is also not only your what you see, but what the audience sees. Is there anything that your audience sees that they have conceived like this view of your channel or you that you like? If so, what is it?
Um, I think, I hope that my audience sees that I've never had a question that's made me really, I mean, questions make me think, but like, I'm used to doing conversations like this, so like, I've never had a question really like super challenge me. So I'm really excited about this, Elijah. I'm really excited. I would hope that my audience sees that there is depth, right? And that beneath the exteriors that we have, like, there is a lot of things that go unnoticed because we might be afraid of being minimized, or we might be afraid of being misunderstood. And the truth is, if you are ever especially misunderstood, like maybe you say something that doesn't, necessarily articulate well, like, be accountable for it and, explain yourself and correct it, right? So like, I pride myself on transparency, being upfront with people, being forthright, having difficult conversations, and ultimately being able to kind of diffuse things, right? I love debates because, like, in debates, I like, one of my biggest advantages is that I'm very good at diffusing things. So like, if people get upset over something, I'm like that mediator that like works toward um smoothing things out just a little bit, right? But I guess I would hope that my audience also sees the fact that all of these conversations require, I guess, some degree of wisdom slash emotional self awareness, right? And there was a point in my life where I had neither of those, and I have some of that now. I'm growing. I think the realization that I'm always growing is also significant, right? As a creator, as a human, and I hope that people seeing that I think about it in that way and that I have that trajectory is humanizing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the fact that, like, yes, like, I've gotten to where I am, but there's still so much further to go. Is there really any end point in bettering ourselves as people? I don't think so, because what defines a good person changes, as time goes on, right?
Right. Everybody, every creator, everybody who does art, which, I mean, if we're gonna argue a point, everybody makes art. Everybody has a style. And what would you define as the Donny Winter style?
Ooh, the Donny Winter style.
That sounds like a good drink too.
It does kind of. I'm gonna crack open my drink recipes later and figure out something. Um, well, okay. So I'm gonna to make it a little bit easier. I'm gonna lump it into two different categories,
Go
right?
ahead.
Well, three different categories. So there will be fan fiction, fan poetry, and YouTube, right? For YouTube, my style is, I would argue, intellectual banter. You know, I really love having fun with people, having conversations with them, but also having like a level of emotional slash intellectual depth to a conversation. Which, if you watch Growing Up with Godzilla, I hope that that is something that you will glean from listening to the conversations. When it comes to poetry, because I like, along with being a teacher, like I am a published poet. I that's my area of expertise as an English teacher. But for poetry, my style is definitely free verse, and I would say that I'm very much a nature poet. I love like weaving nature in. Even in my Godzilla related poems, you'll notice that. Fan fiction, stylistically speaking, ooh, the Donny style in fan fiction. Humanizing the kaiju to a certain extent. Like, you don't want to humanize them too much, right? Because the point of a kaiju is being, this strange, inhuman beast, right? However, kaiju as characters, they have motivations, they have desires, they have, needs, right? In my fanfics, I really want to emphasize on that because my goal is to make kaiju those characters that people can connect with in some way, right? Because the whole point of many creative outlets is connection.
Right.
So,
You've also talked about how you like collaboration and
yeah.
networking and all of that. How have your peers that you've collaborated with, or maybe not collaborated with yet, how have they impacted you as a content creator?
Well, first, they've helped me grow as a person. Because, especially, I would say that most of my collaborating has come through growing up with Godzilla, right? Because each episode, like, I might do a couple of episodes here and there where it's just me talking by myself, but most of the episodes feature a guest. And learning other people's stories and listening to their experiences and how they entered the Godzilla fandom, how they fell in love with the franchise and what the franchise did for them, it's helped me develop a better understanding of my own history and my own relationship with the media as well. And it's been very humbling, it's been very empowering, I think. And I like every episode, I think, has such a unique perspective that I value so much. Like, I know, like, recently, like, I had another friend of mine asked me, like, well, what is your favorite episode of Growing Up with Godzilla? And I can pinpoint like specific like conversations that I really loved, but it's really hard to choose because each of them check off all of those boxes for me, because we do have those like really deep conversations where I get to know people. So I guess that would be like my biggest reward from the collaborating, is I feel as though I'm being enriched slash empowered through the conversations.
This one, I'm always curious to hear what people think. So let's say tomorrow the internet crashes for 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, all of your content has been wiped. There is no backup data. There is no external hard drive. There is no USB drive. Everything is gone. Let's say, and then somehow a vacuum takes all of your art and everything. Everything's gone. Everything you've ever created.
Hmm.
What would you do?
Cry. Like that would, like, a cry would probably be the first thing. Uh well, I would say that, like, create like at a time in my life when I felt minimized and like erased, right? Bullying, etc. Like, creative outlets were kind of my way of just proving my existence. Like, as you when you create something, you take a small morsel of yourself and you put it into that thing that you're creating, right? And if all of that ceased to exist, like I would probably be a mess for a while. I would. I would bounce back because as a creator, like we have a bandwidth, we have like little batteries in ourselves where we're like, okay, well we're gonna do something new, we're gonna start something fresh, right? So at a certain point, after grieving the loss, the immense loss of all of that stuff, I would start again. I think that's the important thing as a creator is like if you get stagnant, if you want to give up and want to quit, knowing how to empower yourself to start again is so significant.
And would you do anything differently, or would you do you think you have found your groove?
I think I found my groove. Um, I would probably I would go back to the drawing board, no pun intended, and work more on art because deep down, like I have like a very artistic mind when it comes to like physical art, painting, drawing, etc. I just don't have the patience. I would find a way to kind of train myself to have the patience to do it because I would love to do that.
Many people have a problem of creating these personas, these alternative identities outside of themselves, whether it's podcasting or YouTubing or uh, vlogging or writing. Everybody creates this persona. And one thing that I feel like I've learned is the content you create, Donnie, is the raw you. There is no other person. It is you. How have you accomplished that?
So, it's interesting that you mentioned this because a couple of weeks ago my partner and I were talking and he sometimes will joke about like my creative outlets because he has argued that sometimes I sound like a different person on YouTube. I think that we all have different modes in which we express ourselves, right?
Right.
So like on YouTube, like right now, I would say that this is my my performative mode, which is kind of like my teacher mode. Like when I'm standing in front of a classroom or when I'm in front of a camera, I work toward being more confident than I normally would be in person. Because in person, I'm kind of quiet, I'm a little introverted. But in spaces like this, I feel more confident and able to express myself. And there have been people that I've witnessed who've had similar characteristics and they've been criticized for being inauthentic or anything like that. I don't really think that like I mentioned, I don't think we have one mode of expression. Like in whatever space that we're in, we adapt ourselves to different situations. Um, I kind of in my mind I connect it similarly to the way I connect being like with being LGBTQ plus because in different spaces like it's called code switching. Like I might masculinize myself in a certain situation if I'm not feeling safe, right? But would a person say like, well, are you not being your authentic self, right? Are you being someone different? Are you putting on a persona? In a way, yes, but I'm able to recognize it and it's still part of me. Like if you are doing it and you can't recognize it, then I think that's where it becomes an area of a concern, right? Um, but I guess I've gotten to this point to finally get to answering your question. Um, I've been able to kind of get to this point where I can be raw, but I've also learned to balance like safety as well. Um, but I think at the end of the day, it just has been experience, right? Like if you look at my old YouTube videos, you'll see that I would speak completely differently because a lack of experience, lack of confidence. Um, in 2009, I would have never dreamed of facilitating an interview or having collaborative experiences with people. Fast forward to now, I am much better with that, and I attribute YouTube especially to improving my communication skills and giving me the ability to go with the flow of a conversation and allow it to feel natural, right? I think it's all interconnected. And the personas that we create, in my opinion, are all extensions of a root persona that we all have.
I know you're running low on time. I just got one last question for you, and it's a little basic,
I
but
love a basic question.
I view this question as, I mean, they're all really important because there's so much
Yeah.
to learn. But this one I always view as important because beyond just like, if I was, I was answering questions beyond what I think, I would hope somebody takes away from my answers and learns from it.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
what lessons would you tell a new content creator, whether they are doing kaiju or just fan fiction or writing or poetry or maybe even art? What would you
That's a good.
tell a new creator?
That's a good question. The first thing that I would tell them is there will be many instances where you will feel like giving up, whether it be lack of views, someone telling you that they don't like your work, or just people not believing in you. Regardless, don't allow any person like that to extinguish that creative spark that you have. Because I firmly believe that the world deserves to witness what we have going on in our interiors, right? And I feel like if you rob the world of that, you're also sabotaging yourself in a certain way, right? Because we gain something through content creation, through art, through fan fiction writing, any of that, that is an examination of the human experience, but also like it is a legacy of sorts, right? Like we're putting ourselves out there in some way, like we're taking pieces of ourselves and putting it into what we create. And I think that that is just a validation of existence, right? The other piece of advice I would say would be, um, kind of going back to that work life balance, you have to make time for your creative outlets. Again, if you don't make time for those things, you're kind of sabotaging yourself in a certain way. And it's not fair to you to deny yourself the opportunities to express or to create. And I would say my last piece of advice is always be open to constructive feedback, right? Be open to constructive feedback because if you don't allow yourself to grow as a creator, that is like the easiest way to fall into writer's block or stagnancy in some way. And you never want to become, you know, angry at your creative outlets, right? Because if you do that, then you'll resent them and not want to continue, right? So if you follow all the three of those things, I think that at least for me has helped me flourish as a creator.
Okay. Well, before we wrap things up here, we gotta do the shameless plugs. We gotta know where we can find
Oh,
you,
a
support
plug.
you, and make it so that people can watch all of your and read all of your amazing content.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, so obviously, if you go to my YouTube channel, Donny Winter, I try to keep everything basic social media wise. So if you type in Donny Winter on YouTube, you'll find my channel. That is where my Growing Up with Godzilla show is. We are on season 2 of the show now. There's an entire podcast playlist. You can watch it from the beginning if you want. You can pick out specific episodes if you want. I've had like Travis from Kaiju Ramen has been on one of my episodes of Growing Up with Godzilla, and I'm sure that I will no doubt have more individuals from Kaiju Ramen on in the future. Uh, if you are interested in reading poetry, I am a poet, and there are instances where Godzilla bleeds into my poetry as well. You can find my poetry on Amazon. The book off the top of my head that I think of is Feats of Alchemy. There, I have an entire series of poems that focuses on the mad scientist doctors from the Godzilla franchise. A couple of them were published in issue 5 of Kaiju Ramen as well. So, not to do like a reverse plug for Kaiju Ramen, but yeah, feel free to go check those out. Again, if you see other creators out there doing podcasts, subscribe to them, follow them. because many of us, we may not have big platforms, but with what we put out there, I think that having that content to consume is very enriching for the fandom.
Awesome. So with that, we're going to wrap things up here. Um, I'm Elijah Thomas, the production manager, publicist, and staff writer for Kaiju Ramen Media. You can find me on Twitter at ET13 Productions, on YouTube at ET13 Productions, or you can go support my podcast, Kaiju Conversation, on any social media platforms. Thank you, Donny, so much for coming on today. I've appreciated it and love this interview. This was so great. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for allowing this outlet for so many people. It's very important. So, Elijah, thank you. And Kaiju Ramen, thank you as well.
Thank you. So, thank you guys so much. And we will catch you on the flip side. I still don't know how to close out interview videos, but we're going to go with that.
I love it. It's perfect. Bye, everyone.